Now, if you're just starting, you may not necessarily know what you want to get into. So I think for the average person, you just want to get into music composition or music production in general. I think for you, the best DAW to pick between Logic Pro X and Ableton Live is... Hey there, fellow music creators, Andrew Southworth, GeneraStudios.com, here to teach you how to better express yourself through music, be proud of the music you create, and help you achieve your musical goals. So in this video, we're going to be talking about Logic Pro X versus Ableton Live. Before I dive into it, I want to tell you how I use each of them in my workflow and what the strengths of each of them are. So by the way, if you're not familiar with the term DAW or DAW, that means Digital Audio Workstation, and that's what Logic Pro X and Ableton Live both are. So I've been using Logic Pro X for I think the last 10 years or more, and up until about 6 months ago, I was using it exclusively. So about 6 months ago, I decided to try a free trial of Ableton Live because I saw the push-to integration with the DAW, and I was very impressed with the workflow. I really wanted that, which is why originally I bought a machine by Native Instruments, or Machina by Native Instruments. And so I tried it, and I loved it, and I bought it. So I got Ableton Live 10 Suite and the push-to controller. And another reason why I specifically tried out Ableton Live originally was because I was getting more into making electronic music, and I've heard that it's really good for making electronic music. So now my workflow typically is for all my metal projects, my vocal recording guitar, anything that's audio-based or mixing or mastering related, I do inside of Logic Pro X, and anything that's electronic music related or doesn't revolve around recording heavy audio, I record or I work inside of Ableton Live. So I have my computer set up, I have my checkered blue polo shirt on, and we're ready to dive in. So first, we're going to talk about Logic Pro X. So I think one of the biggest strengths of Logic Pro is its ability to handle the comping of takes. And as a vocalist, this is incredibly important, and it's one of the first things I looked for when I got Ableton Live. I was very discouraged when they didn't have it. Now, if you're not familiar with comping, basically, if I loop this little section here and I hit record, I'll turn off this metronome so it doesn't freak out. It's going to start recording. You can hear my voice, and then it'll just loop around, record on top of it, and then it'll just keep doing takes until I just hit the space bar and stop it. Now what I can actually do, if I zoom in, I can actually combine these takes however I want. So I can go through and I can pick individual words or phrases that were the best between all these takes, or I can just pick an entire take. I can just select it there. Then when I'm done, I can just hit flatten and merge, or I can just always keep them there. So you have a forever kind of database of the takes you did if you want to change it later. In Ableton Live, there's a workaround for this, but it's very annoying that it's not just built in like Logic. So another huge strength of Logic Pro is its dedicated mixing window, which you see down here. You can access by clicking this button. And as you create new tracks, they just get added down here. Now it's kind of similar to the session view in Ableton Live, but the thing is that it shows you all your plugins in one place. So as you start adding plugins down here, they just get added. So at any point you want to adjust any of the plugins on any of your tracks, you just go down to the bottom and you can click it. You can also just visually see what you have. It shows you all your sends, it shows you your outputs, and it has all the necessary information. So it's much more convenient than Ableton, where you have to bounce around from two individual tracks to actually see the plugins that you have in each track. And then the mixing workflow in general is just a lot smoother inside of Logic. Now the next strength is that I think that Logic Pro has better stock plugins. This might be somewhat of a controversial topic, but if you look online, you'll see that in general, most people kind of agree that Logic has some of the best stock plugins in the world, and there's a ton of them. So I mean, if I scroll through all these categories, you'll see that there is a ton of built-in stock plugins, and they're very good. You know, Logic's been in this for a while. And this EQ plugin is incredibly detailed and powerful. Like, it's all graphic based, unlike the one in Ableton Live, which is partially graphical, but it's not as powerful as this. It doesn't look as good, and and it's an EQ, so they can do the same things, but the workflow it doesn't feel as smooth. And that's not the only example. If I open the compressor, for example, this has the ability to emulate a bunch of different styles of compressors. It changes the knobs for each one. It's doing different emulations of actual hardware gear. And the built-in compressor in Ableton Live is just a single compressor off of, it's just one that they made up. It doesn't have all these emulations. It has just one thing that you can use, which is kind of similar to probably this one in Logic. But in general, Logic gives you a lot more plugins, and honestly, I think they're better. Whether they sound better or not, that's probably really up to the person that's actually using them more than the plugins themselves. Now, this last strength I'm going to talk about isn't really a strength in the software. It's just that the price of Logic Pro X is only $200, and it includes, from what I can tell, lifetime free updates, because I've never had to update Logic Pro, and I've had it for like a decade. So it's incredibly cheap compared to something like Ableton Live. Now, when you look at the price of Live, they do have a version that's $99, but I don't really recommend anyone gets that because it's so limiting. The standard one is $450, so more than double the price. That's probably I wouldn't even consider intro for most people. Standards when you should start considering it. So you're at 2.5 times the price or 2.25 times the price of Logic. I bought the Suite, so I paid 4 times more for Live than I did for Logic. And the thing is that every year or two, I'm not sure since I've only had it for 6 months, but it seems like every couple of years they put out a new version, and they do offer a discount to upgrade, but you do have to pay for upgrades. As you can see, log in to see your upgrade prices. So there's one thing to keep in mind, that if you're just getting into this and maybe you don't have that much money as a startup cost, you want to buy some other gear too, that Logic has a much cheaper price point. All right, so now let's get into Ableton Live, and in particular, I'm using Ableton Live 10. So one of the most powerful things about Ableton Live is its session view. Now, if you remember from Logic Pro, it had a view similar to this, where time runs left to right. You have all your tracks running vertically like this. Now, the session view, you have all your tracks running from left to right, and you have different loops or patterns in each of these slots, and you can copy and paste them around. And you can actually play them in any order. So I can click play, and I have my audio off because these are just random clips, but it's playing this. And now let's say I want to click that, it'll start playing that. And it keeps everything perfectly in time with your metronome. And you can play your song in any order, which is one reason why Ableton Live is so powerful for live applications. The next biggest strength of Ableton Live is its improved warp modes relative to Logic. Logic has similar features to Ableton Live's warp mode, but I don't think they're nearly as powerful. So when you import an audio file, you can actually select the original BPM of whatever the audio file is. If I actually copy this and I go over to the arrangement view and paste it in on an audio track, then you can see here that I have it snapped here, and I can actually just adjust it to whatever length I want. So it doesn't matter what original tempo it was in. I can very easily just snap it to the correct tempo of the song that I'm working in. And you can technically do this in Logic, but it doesn't work as nicely. And the other big perk about Ableton Live is you can switch between all these different modes of warping. And some of them are suited for drums, like beats. Some of them are suited for more advanced sound material, like vocals or something like that, or guitar. And I'm not going to get into what each of these ones do because it's kind of complicated, and it would take a whole video in itself. And a friend of mine actually has a very good video explaining the Ableton Live warp modes, so I'm going to link that in the description below and in the card above, so feel free to check that out if you're interested. So this next strength of Ableton Live is huge for me, and it's one reason why when I'm in Ableton Live, I try to use as many stock plugins as possible. Now, I did mention that Logic Pro has more, and I think more high quality plugins, but the thing is, inside of Ableton Live, when you add a stock plugin to a track, you get full controls down here. Now, in Logic, for example, you had to open up the plugin to adjust it. So in Ableton Live, I can keep adding plugins down here as long as they're stock, and I can control them. Now, even if I were to go into like one of my paid plugins, which is this L1 limiter by Waves, you'll see that I don't see anything here, but you can actually click a button here and it'll expose some controls that are pre-configured. And so it makes it very easy. Now, you don't see all the plugins for all your tracks. This is the most similar to Logic's mixing flow, but you don't see any of your plugins here. But the thing is that when you're inside of a track, you get full control over every single plugin, which is incredibly powerful. So related to that is Ableton Live's MIDI control. Every single control you see can be assigned to a MIDI controller. You actually just click this computer MIDI keyboard, and then you click the thing you want, and then you can actually just move a knob on your MIDI controller, and it will start controlling it. Now, there is some things you need to do to get that set up, but it's pretty easy. So it's a big perk if you want to be able to have a hardware interface. And of course, if you get the Ableton Push, that directly ties into it, because every Ableton plugin directly integrates with the Push, and even when you have a plugin like this that doesn't, you can assign anything you want to any of the free knobs that are made for that kind of control on the Push. Another advantage of Ableton Live, I think, is the ability to group tracks, so I can highlight those tracks and group them. And you might be thinking, great, I thought every DAW could do that. And you're right, every DAW can do that. Now, the other thing that you can do is you can make a group inside your group. Logic cannot do that. There's a workaround. If you make a bus, you can send different groups to a bus, and you can make a bus and you can put a bunch of buses in another bus. So you can do it, but you don't have this kind of layered workflow like you do in Ableton Live. And it's not just that. You can group anything. So I can get these plugins. Let's say that changer sounded really good on these drums, and I just hit Command-G, and look, all of a sudden I have a group, okay? And maybe that's something I use a lot. So I just hit Save, and look, it's going to make it a new preset. Video preset. Great. Now I can just drag that on. Let's say I want to add a second one. Ooh, grab that, add a second one. Bam. Now I have it again. So it's incredibly powerful. You can save presets in Logic, but it's not the same. You can't just drag and drop things and just group things so easily as you can in this. Now, the last big perk of Ableton Live, I talked about the price of Logic and how it's significantly cheaper than Ableton Live, but the thing is that you can only run Logic on a Mac. So if you have a Windows computer and you want to get one of these, not anything else, just Logic or Ableton Live, you're going to have to buy an Apple computer before you get into it. So obviously the startup costs of doing that are much more. And before I tell you which DAW I think is better, let me know in the comments if you already use one and what you think about it so we can help out future audio nerds make a more informed decision. So if you're going to be recording mainly acoustic or physical instruments like guitar, bass, vocals, drums, or you're going to be doing mainly mixing work or mastering work for clients, due to the comping workflow, the dedicated mixing window, and the similarity to other bigger commercial DAWs, I think you're going to want to go with Logic Pro X. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is why I use Logic Pro X for all of my metal work, for all of my vocal recording, and for any kind of mixing or mastering jobs that heavily revolve around audio. So if you're going to be working mostly with MIDI or software instruments, or you want a seamless hardware-software interface, or you need a DAW that can actually control a live setup, then you're going to want to go with Ableton Live. And for this reason, I use it for all of my electronic projects, but the workflow aspect is very fast. So sometimes even for audio projects, I will use it to sketch up a song before I take it into Logic and do all the heavy audio recording. Now, if you're just starting, you may not necessarily know what you want to get into. So I think for the average person, you just want to get into music composition or music production in general. I think for you, the best DAW to pick between Logic Pro X and Ableton Live is Ableton Live. So click this video on the top if you want to see what you can do with a brand new MacBook Pro and a copy of Ableton Live 10. Click this video on the bottom if you want to see my top 5 music production tips to write better music. If you're an audio nerd like me, you'll fit in just fine here, so click that subscribe button to become an official audio nerd and ring the bell to stay updated every single time I release a new video.